She didn't scream. That was the first thing Vincent Malone noticed. Most people screamed. When Sal Drift grabbed them, when his thick fingers closed around an arm, or a collar, or a fistful of hair, people screamed. It was a reflex like pulling your hand from a flame. You didn't choose it. It just happened. But this woman didn't scream. She was on her knees in the back hallway of the Blackwood Lounge, both palms pressed flat against the marble floor, where a champagne flute had shattered around her. Blood was already threading through the grout lines between the tiles, thin and dark in the low light. Her black uniform was torn at the shoulder. Her hair had come loose from whatever she'd pinned it into at the start of her shift. And Sal Drift, 260 pounds of bad decisions and worse impulses, was standing over her with one foot raised. She looked up at him, not with defiance, not with anger, just with exhaustion, the kind that lives deep in the bone, the kind you can't fake and can't hide. And she said 5 words. "Please don't kick me. I'm already hurt." She said it quietly. She said it the way a person states a fact, not the way a person begs. There was no performance in it, no calculation, no attempt to manipulate. Just the truth, plain and unvarnished, offered to a man who had very little use for truth in his line of work. Sal hesitated, not because he felt remorse. Sal Drift had never felt remorse about anything in his 38 years on this earth. He hesitated because the words were so unexpected, so stripped of everything he was used to hearing, that for 1/2 second his brain simply could not process them. That half second was enough. Vincent said one word from the shadows at the end of the hall. "Sal." That was all. Just the name. But the way Vincent said it stopped time in that hallway the same way a power outage stops a clock. Sal's foot lowered, slowly, like a man moving against the current of his own momentum. He turned around and whatever expression he'd been wearing collapsed when he saw who was standing there. Vincent Malone walked toward them. He moved the way men move when they have never in their adult life needed to rush. His charcoal suit was immaculate, no tie, the top 2 buttons of his shirt open. Dark hair threaded with gray at the temples, pushed back from a face that had been handsome once, and had since become something harder and more interesting than handsome. He was 42 years old, and he looked like a man who had made every decision in his life deliberately and regretted none of them, even the ones he should have. His eyes moved to Sal first. Then they moved to the woman on the floor. And something happened behind Vincent Malone's eyes that he had not been expecting. He recognized her, not from the club, not from any of his other establishments across the north and west sides of Chicago, from somewhere older than that, from a memory he had carried for 4 years, like a stone in his coat pocket, smooth from handling present, always even when he wasn't consciously reaching for it. He knew that face. He said nothing about it. What he said instead to Sal was this: "Go wait for me in my office. Don't sit down. Don't touch anything. Don't speak to anyone." Sal opened his mouth. Vincent looked at him. Sal closed his mouth and walked away. The hallway was quiet after that. The bass from the main floor thumped through the walls like a second heartbeat, persistent and indifferent. Vincent crouched down to the woman's level. He did not extend his hand immediately. He looked at her hands, first at the blood on her palms, where the broken glass had cut her, and then at the careful way she was holding her torso, slightly stiff, slightly braced, the posture of someone managing pain they have decided not to talk about. He said, "Can you stand?" She looked at him for a moment before answering. Not the way people usually looked at Vincent Malone when they found themselves in a compromised position on the floor of one of his venues. People usually looked at him with fear, layered over pleading, layered over calculation. She looked at him the way you look at a stranger who has just offered you an umbrella in the rain, assessing, cautious, not grateful yet, but not hostile either. She said yes. She stood on her own. She didn't take the hand he offered when he finally offered it. She got her feet under her, straightened her spine, and stood. She was 23, maybe 24, 5'4", dark hair, dark eyes, a bruise beginning to rise along her left jaw that had not come from tonight. She said, "Thank you. I need to get back to work." Vincent Malone had been in rooms with presidents and senators and men who ran organizations that made governments nervous. He had been thanked and threatened and flattered and lied to in 5 languages. In 20 years of operating in the world he operated in, no one had ever, after being rescued from a beating in a back hallway, looked him in the eye and told him they needed to get back to work. He said, "What is your name?" She said, "Nora Callahan." He said, "How long have you worked here?" She said, "3 months." He nodded once. He said, "Go to the staff room. Have someone look at your hands. You are done for the night, full pay." She started to say something. He could see it, the small tightening around her mouth that meant she was going to argue, going to tell him she was fine, going to insist on finishing her shift because she needed the money. He could see all of that in the half second before she stopped herself. She looked at him once more. Then she walked away. Vincent watched her go. He stood there in that hallway alone for a moment, the broken glass catching the dim light around his shoes. And he pressed the memory he had been carrying for 4 years against the present moment and found that they fit together exactly. He had found her. After 4 years, he had found her. He straightened his cuffs and went to deal with Sal Drift. He dealt with Sal in front of the entire main floor. This was deliberate. Vincent had learned a long time ago that consequences only functioned as deterrents when they were witnessed. A lesson delivered in private was a rumor. A lesson delivered in public was a law. He walked Sal to the center of the room where the lights were brightest and the crowd was thickest, and he spoke quietly enough that only the people directly around them could hear. But those people told the people next to them, and those people told the next ring out, and within 90 seconds, the music had not stopped, but every conversation in the Blackwood Lounge had. He said that Sal had put his hands on a member of his staff. He said that Sal had threatened a woman under his protection in his establishment. He said that this was the kind of mistake a man made once. Then he looked around the room with those dark, unhurried eyes, and he said something else. He said that Nora Callahan was under his personal protection, that she was not to be questioned, not to be followed, not to be touched by anyone for any reason, for any price. That this was not a request and it was not a negotiation. He said it the same way he said everything, quietly, without drama, the way a man states a fact. The room understood. Sal was escorted out. Nora was in the staff room when Jenna, the hostess, came to find her. She was sitting on the wooden bench with her palms wrapped in paper towels, pressing them together, not looking at anything in particular. She had heard the music pause in that way. It pauses when a room collectively holds its breath and then restart, and she understood that something had happened out there that she was not fully informed about. Jenna stood in the doorway with an expression Nora had never seen on her face before. Something between awe and unease. She said, "Mr. Malone wants to see you. His office, when you're ready." Nora looked at her wrapped hands. She said, "All right." The office was on the second floor, separated from the noise of the main room by a heavy door and a long hallway lined with photographs she had never been up here to see before. Black and white images of Chicago mostly. The lakefront in winter. The skyline from across the water. A photograph of a man she didn't recognize standing in front of a building that no longer existed. His hand resting on the shoulder of a boy who might have been 8 or 9 years old, squinting into the sun. Vincent was behind his desk when she entered. He had reading glasses on, which surprised her, and he was looking at something on his desk that he set aside when she came in. He took the glasses off. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. This was a habit of his that she would come to recognize this pause before beginning, this way of taking the full measure of a thing before engaging with it. It was not aggressive, it was simply precise. He reached into the drawer of his desk and took out a photograph and set it on the desk between them. She looked at it. It was grainy the way security camera images always are, blown up past their natural resolution so that the details softened and blurred at the edges. But the image was clear enough. A hospital hallway, a gurney, an older woman lying on it connected to monitors, her face turned slightly to the side. And next to her, holding her hand, a young woman, dark hair, small, leaning in close to say something to the woman on the gurney. Nora looked at the photograph for a long time. She said, "Where did you get this?" He said, "The ICU at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. 4 years ago, August 14th. She said, "That's me." He said, "I know." The room was very quiet. He said, "The woman you are holding the hand of in that photograph is my mother. Her name is Margaret Malone. She goes by May. She was at the Green City Market on Armitage that morning, buying tomatoes for her garden when she had a cardiac event. She was alone. She was on the ground for approximately 90 seconds before you reached her." Nora remembered it with the kind of clarity that only certain moments carry, the moments when the ordinary texture of a day splits open and something urgent and real comes through. She had been setting up her section of the market booth when she heard the sound, not a scream, just a sharp intake of breath, and then a thud that was somehow worse than any scream could have been. She had turned around and there was a woman on the pavement, one hand pressed to her chest, her eyes open but unfocused, her face the color of old chalk. Nora had not thought about what to do. She had simply done it. She had called 911 while she was already moving toward the woman. She had gotten down on her knees on the pavement, not caring about her jeans, and she had taken the woman's hand and held it. The woman had looked up at her with an expression that Nora had never forgotten, this desperate animal terror of someone who understands that their body has betrayed them in a public place and that strangers are watching them be afraid. Nora had leaned close and she had said, "You are going to be all right. I am right here. Help is coming. You are not alone." She had ridden in an ambulance. The paramedics had led her because the woman's grip on her hand had been so tight they were afraid to pry it loose. She had sat in the waiting room of the ICU for 2 hours until a man in his late 30s arrived with two other people who were clearly family, and she had watched them absorb the news from the doctor, and she had seen the relief move through them like a wave, and she had thought, all right, she is going to be okay. And she had quietly gathered her jacket from the chair and walked out. She had not left her name. She had not thought to. Vincent was watching her face as she moved through the memory. He said, "My mother regained consciousness and asked for the young woman who came in with her. The nurses told her the woman had left. She asked them to find her. They had no information. She asked me to find her. I have been trying for 4 years." Nora looked at the photograph again. She said, "I didn't know who she was. I had no idea." He said, "I know that. That is what made it remarkable." She said, "I only did what anyone would have done." He said, "No, you didn't. Most people would have watched from a distance and waited for someone else to act. You got on your knees on the pavement and held her hand. You rode in the ambulance with a stranger. You stayed until you knew she was all right, and then you left without asking for anything." He paused. He said, "In my world, Nora, that kind of behavior is so rare, I was not sure I believed my mother when she described it." The silence between them had a different quality now, less formal. Something had been established, something foundational, and they were both adjusting to the new arrangement of the room. She said, "How can I help you?" He said, "You have already done the most important thing, but my mother would like to thank you herself. She has been carrying this for 4 years. I would like you to meet her if you are willing." She looked at him. She said, "All right." She stood up to leave, and he said one more thing. He said, "The car outside will take you home tonight, and tomorrow, and for the foreseeable future." She looked like she was going to argue with him about it. Then she looked at the photograph on his desk one more time, at the woman who might have died on a pavement 4 years ago but didn't, and she said, "All right." The city was cold on the drive home. October in Chicago has a specific quality of cold. Not the deep, paralyzing cold of February, but a cold that arrives suddenly like a door opening onto weather you weren't prepared for. Nora sat in the back of a black SUV she hadn't asked for, driven by a man in a dark jacket who introduced himself as Garrett and said nothing else, and she watched the neighborhood slide past the window. She was 23 years old. She had been 23 for 4 months. Her parents had been dead for 3 years. The accident had happened on a Sunday in November on the I-90, heading west in the kind of fog that settles over Chicago in the fall like a held breath. A truck had struck their vehicle from behind. The truck had been unregistered. The driver had never been found. The police had called it a tragic accident and filed it accordingly, and that had been, as far as anyone official was concerned, the end of it. It had not been the end of it for Nora. But grief had a way of being replaced eventually, not resolved, never resolved, but replaced by the immediate demands of survival. Her brother Liam was 14 years old when their parents died. There was no one else. No aunts or uncles worth contacting. No grandparents still living. There was Nora and there was Liam, and there was the decision Nora made without deliberating about it, the same way she had made the decision to get on her knees on the pavement next to May Malone. She didn't think about it. She just did it. She kept the apartment. She got a second job. She showed up. Liam was 17 now and a straight-A student who had been quietly compiling a list of college applications that he kept in a folder on his laptop and never showed Nora, because he knew what looking at it would do to her. The joy of it sharpened against the impossibility of the cost. She had seen the folder once accidentally when he had left his laptop open on the kitchen table. She had looked at the list of schools, all of them, good schools, one of them extraordinary, and she had closed the laptop and gone into her bedroom and stood at the window for a long time. She did not tell him she had seen it. She worked the breakfast shift at Harlan's Diner on Wicker Park 6 days a week, and she worked evenings at the Blackwood Lounge 4 nights a week, and she sent money to the utility company and the landlord and the grocery store, and she saved what was left, which was not very much, and she did not think too far ahead because thinking too far ahead had a way of making the present moment unbearable. The apartment was on the third floor of a building on North Kedzie in Logan Square. The neighborhood had been changing for the past 18 months, not in the direction Nora would have chosen. There were more corner conversations that stopped when she walked past, more nights when the sounds from outside her window were harder to interpret. She had told Liam not to walk home after 9. She had said it casually as though it were just a preference, and he had accepted it the same way, and they had both understood what they were not saying. Garrett pulled up to the curb in front of her building and stopped. He said, "Mr. Malone asked me to let you know there will be someone outside the building tonight." She said, "That is not necessary." He said, "I know, but it will happen anyway." She got out of the car. The lobby light was out again. She took the stairs by memory, one hand trailing the wall, and unlocked the apartment door and stepped inside. Liam was on the couch with his calculus textbook open on his chest and the television on at low volume, the particular tableau of a 17-year-old who had been asleep for an hour and would deny it strenuously. He opened his eyes when she came in. He said, "You are early?" She said, "Long night." He looked at her face. He had their mother's way of looking at people, thorough and unhurried, not missing things. He said, "Are you okay?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Nora." She sat down on the couch next to him and looked at the ceiling. She said, "I am going to tell you something, and I need you not to panic." He said, "That is a very good opening for something panic-inducing." She told him about the evening, not all of it. She didn't tell him about the broken glass or her palms or the specific way Sal Drift's shadow had fallen across her in that hallway. She told him about Vincent Malone recognizing her in the photograph and the woman she had sat with in an ambulance 4 years ago, turning out to be the mother of the man who owned the Blackwood Lounge and apparently a significant portion of the north side of Chicago. Liam was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So you saved a mob boss's mom?" She said, "I didn't know that is what I was doing." He said, "Yeah, I would imagine not." He paused. "Is this good or bad?" She said, "I honestly don't know yet." He said, "Are we in danger?" She said, "No, I don't think so." He seemed very certain about wanting to protect us, not threaten us. Liam looked at her for a long moment with their mother's eyes. He said, "You know what I think." She said, "What?" He said, "I think you have been doing this your whole life, walking into something that needs you without stopping to ask whether it is going to cost you. Most people see something hard and they go the other direction. You just keep moving." She said, "Go to bed." He said, "You too." She didn't. She sat at the kitchen table after he had gone to his room, and she looked at her wrapped hands in the low light, and she thought about Vincent Malone's face when she had told him she needed to get back to work. The thing that had moved through his expression, brief and controlled, but there. She had been reading people across diner counters and bar tops for years. She knew what it looked like when something surprised a person who had decided nothing would surprise them anymore. She thought about what it meant to be seen that clearly by someone she had just met. She thought about what it might cost. She had not been prepared for Vincent Malone. She had been preparing in one way or another since she was 20 years old, and the police had knocked on her door on a Sunday evening with their hats in their hands. She had been prepared for difficulty and financial pressure and the specific exhaustion of carrying something heavy for a long time without anyone offering to help. She had not been prepared for a man who looked at her the way Vincent Malone had looked at her and saw something worth protecting. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. The next morning, Vincent sat in his office at 7 in the morning across from Desmond Hatch, who was 61 years old and had been in this city longer than most of the buildings they were sitting inside of. Desmond was not a large man, and he was not an intimidating man, but he had a mind that worked the way good engines work quietly and without waste. And he had been the person Vincent called when he needed to understand something rather than simply act on it. Vincent had told him about Nora, all of it. The photograph, the Green City Market, the ambulance, the 4 years of searching, the hallway and the broken glass, and the 5 words she had said to Sal Drift that had traveled from her mouth to Vincent's chest like something thrown with extraordinary accuracy. Desmond had listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Vincent valued most about him. When Vincent finished, Desmond said, "What do you want to know?" Vincent said everything. Parents, brother, financials, how she ended up in my club, how she ended up in that hallway, the injury she was already carrying before tonight because those ribs did not come from Sal. All of it. Desmond made a note. Then he was quiet for a moment. He said, "There is something else. About the family." Vincent said, "What about them?" Desmond said, "Her parents. The accident on the I-93 years ago." Vincent said, "What about it?" Desmond said, "I started pulling the file last night. Before you called me, I had seen her name in the employment records when we ran the standard background check when she started here 3 months ago, and something about the accident detail flagged for me at the time. I could not say why exactly. I just noted it and moved on. When you called me last night and gave me her name again, I went back." Vincent said, "Desmond." Desmond said, "You need to hear what I found before you do anything else." The room was quiet. Outside the window, Chicago was beginning its morning. The sound of the city reaching up to the second floor like something that had always been there, would always be there indifferent to what was decided in the rooms above it. Vincent looked at Desmond Hatch. He said, "Tell me." Desmond opened the folder on his knee, and in the long pause before he began to speak, something shifted in the room. Something that had been held in balance carefully, deliberately for 3 years began very slowly to tip. Vincent did not know it yet, but the answer to a question he had never thought to ask had been sitting in a filing cabinet in a building with his company's name on the door, and Nora Callahan's father had put it there. Desmond spoke for 20 minutes without stopping. Vincent did not interrupt him once. When Desmond finished, the office was the kind of quiet that follows something irreversible. Not the ordinary quiet of a morning office, but the specific silence of a room in which the shape of the world has just been altered, and both people in it are adjusting to the new arrangement. Vincent stood and walked to the window and looked at Chicago. His hands were at his sides. His face was controlled in the way his face was always controlled, carefully, deliberately, with the precision of a man who had learned early that showing what you felt was a form of exposure you could not always afford. But Desmond, who had known him for 11 years, could see it anyway. In the set of his shoulders, in the stillness. Vincent said, "How long have you known?" Desmond said, "I suspected last night. I confirmed it this morning before I came here." Vincent said, "In cord." Desmond said, "The payment records are clean on the surface, but there is a shell account in Gary registered to a holding company that dissolved 4 days after the accident. That holding company was capitalized through an account that traces back to Cord Whelan through 2 intermediary entities. It took some work to find, but it is there. It is documented." Vincent said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Thomas Callahan worked for me for 11 years. Desmond said yes. Vincent said he found what Cord was doing and he was building a record to report it. Desmond said the evidence points to it clearly. He was 2 weeks from submitting his documentation through official channels when the accident occurred. Vincent said, and Cord had him killed, using the infrastructure of my company, in my name. Desmond said yes. That is what the evidence indicates. The city outside the window went about its morning. Buses and traffic and the ordinary motion of a place that never stopped. Vincent watched it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Do not tell her yet. Not until I have the complete picture. I need to know the full scope of what Cord has been running before we move. If we act without the full picture, parts of it disappear and we never recover them." Desmond said, "Understood." Vincent said, "How long?" Desmond said, 2 days, maybe 3. Vincent said, "All right, find everything. Leave nothing unaccounted for." He turned from the window. He said, "And Desmond, whatever it costs to finish this, whatever operational exposure it creates, it does not matter. We finish it." Desmond looked at him. He said, "Understood." The house in Oak Park sat behind a low stone wall and an iron gate that opened without a sound. The way things open when they are maintained by people who understand that squeaking hinges are a form of carelessness. The garden was still holding the last of its autumn color, rust and gold, against the gray October sky, and the front walk was lined with boxwood that had been shaped into something precise and permanent-looking, the kind of landscaping that takes decades to achieve. Nora stood at the front door with her hands folded in front of her and told herself this was just a conversation. The door opened before she could knock. Margaret Malone was smaller than Nora remembered. In her memory, shaped by the distortion of crisis and fear, The woman on the pavement had seemed significant in size, an impression created probably by the force of her personality or by the simple weight of what was happening to her. In person, in the doorway of her home in Oak Park on a Tuesday afternoon, May Malone was 5'2" and wore a cream-colored blouse and a single strand of pearls and looked like someone's grandmother and like someone who had never in her life permitted anyone to treat her like someone's grandmother. She looked at Nora, her eyes filled immediately. She said, "There you are." She said it the way you say something you have been waiting a long time to say. Not with relief exactly, or not only with relief, but with the specific quality of a person who has been holding a sentence in their mouth for 4 years and is finally allowed to speak it. She took Nora's face in both hands. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She looked at her the way you look at something you were afraid you had lost forever and have now found intact. Then she pulled her inside. The house smelled like bread and something with rosemary in it and old wood and flowers. There were photographs everywhere, the kind of accumulation that happens in a house where people have actually lived. Not arranged for display, but simply placed where they made sense on windowsills and piano tops, and the small table in the hallway that held a bowl of keys and a stack of mail, and a framed picture of a boy who was clearly Vincent at around age 10, standing in a baseball uniform, with a gap where a front tooth had been squinting into the sun with an expression of absolute seriousness. Nora looked at the photograph as she passed it and thought, of course, he was like that even then. The dining room was sunny and warm. The table was set for two with the kind of care that means something. Cloth napkins, real silverware, a small vase of late-season flowers from the garden. May had cooked. There was a dish of pasta that smelled like it had been simmering since morning, and a loaf of bread that was still warm, and a salad with tomatoes that tasted, when Nora eventually tried one, like something from a different season entirely. May talked through the meal with the ease of a woman who had never been uncertain of her welcome in a room. She talked about the garden and about the neighborhood and about a book she had just finished that she thought Nora should read. She asked about Liam with a specificity that meant Vincent had told her things. She asked what he wanted to study and where he was hoping to go. Nora answered carefully at first, the way she always answered questions about Liam, managing the exposure, not letting herself feel too much of the hope embedded in the answers, because hope had a way of becoming weight when you couldn't afford what it pointed toward. May watched her do this. She said, "You don't have to protect yourself from wanting things for him. Not here." Nora looked at her. May reached across the table and took her hand. She said, "What you did for me 4 years ago." She stopped. She started again. She said, "I have thought about it every day. Not in the way you think about something, Sam, in the way you think about something that changed you. You held my hand on a pavement and you told me I was not alone. And in that moment, I believed you completely the way you believe very few things in your life." She paused. "You saved my life, Nora. And then you disappeared, and I spent 4 years wanting the chance to tell you that what you did mattered. That you mattered." The word landed the way certain words land, not loudly, not with drama, but with the precise weight of something that has been true for a long time and is only now being said. Nora did not cry easily. She had not cried at the hospital when the doctors told her about her parents. She had not cried at the funeral. She had cried once alone in the bathroom of Harlan's Diner 3 weeks after the accident, and she had washed her face and gone back to her shift, and she had not done it again since, not because the grief was not there, but because there was no time and no space and no one to hold it with her. She cried now. She did not try to stop it. She sat at May Malone's table and let it happen, and May held her hand and did not say anything, and did not look away, and did not treat it as something to be resolved or hurried through. After a while, Nora wiped her face with a cloth napkin and said, "I'm sorry." May said, "Don't be." There was a pause. Then May stood and went to the sideboard and came back with a small envelope. She set it on the table. She said, "This is for Liam. Full tuition wherever he decides to go. Room and board, books, everything. It is already arranged. This is not something you can refuse." Nora looked at the envelope. She thought about the folder on his laptop, the list of schools, the name at the top of the list. She said, "This is too much." May said, "It is nowhere near enough." She reached up and unclasped something from around her own neck, a chain silver with a small pendant in the shape of a rose. Simple, precise, the kind of thing that has been worn so long it has become part of the person wearing it. She held it out. She said, "My mother gave me this." Her mother gave it to her. In our family, it goes to the daughters we hold closest. She looked at Nora steadily. You are family now, not because of obligation, because I choose you to be. Do you understand the difference? Nora understood the difference. She let May fasten the chain around her neck. The pendant rested just below her collarbone, warm from having been worn by someone else. May sat back down. She said now, tell me about your brother. What does he want to study? And Nora, for the first time in 3 years, talked about Liam without managing the exposure. She talked about him freely, the way you talk about someone you love to someone who is genuinely interested. And the afternoon light moved across the dining room, and the food cooled on the plates, and May listened with her whole attention. And it was the most ordinary and the most remarkable hour Nora had spent in a very long time. Vincent arrived at the end of it. He came in through the kitchen, the way a man comes into his mother's house without ceremony, and he stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the two of them at the table, and something moved through his expression that he controlled before it could settle into anything identifiable. His mother looked at him. She said she stayed for the whole meal. He said, I see that. He looked at Nora. He said, the car is outside whenever you are ready. Nora stood and helped May clear the plates, and May embraced her at the door the way she had when Nora arrived, both hands on her face, holding her there for a moment. She said, Sunday dinners, starting this week. I will not take no for an answer. Nora said, all right. The drive back to the city was quiet. She sat in the back of the SUV with the envelope in her bag and the pendant newly warm at her collarbone, and the particular sensation of someone who has been handed something so much larger than they were prepared to receive that their hands have not yet understood how to hold it. She thought about calling Liam. She would tell him tonight. She would watch his face when he understood that the school he wanted was now possible, and she would try to hold herself together while it happened. The Varro brothers were not subtle men. This was, in the opinion of everyone who had ever dealt with them professionally, their primary liability. Felix Varro was 34 and ran the Southside operation with the blunt efficiency of someone who had gotten where he was through a combination of violence and stubbornness rather than intelligence. His younger brother Anton was 31 and faster and meaner and worse in every way that mattered when you were trying to avoid causing problems that would outlast your ability to manage them. They had been watching Nora for 6 days, not because they had anything against her specifically. She was simply the most accessible pressure point in a situation they had been circling for months. The question of how seriously Vincent Malone meant his protection of this woman, and whether the publicly declared protection was real or performative. Felix had come into Harlan's diner 3 days after the announcement at the Blackwood Lounge. He had sat at the counter. He had ordered coffee. He had looked at Nora with the specific measuring look of a man deciding whether something is worth the cost. She had brought him his coffee. She had looked at him once briefly with those dark eyes that did not give anything away, and she had said, can I get you anything else? He had said, nice place. She had said nothing. He had said, you work here every morning. She had said, is there something I can get you? He had left a $50 bill for a $4 coffee and walked out, and she had stood with the bill in her hand and understood precisely what it meant and said nothing to anyone. But she had turned back to the counter, and in the mirror behind the coffee station, she had noted the black sedan parked across the street. She had said nothing. She had remembered. 2 nights later at the Blackwood Lounge, she worked her section and watched Cord Whelan the way she had been watching him for days. She had worked around men like Cord her entire adult life, men who occupied space with a specific kind of authority that was calibrated to be noticed without being too obvious about its own noticing. She had learned to be invisible around those men. She had learned that invisibility had uses. Cord was 38, dark hair close-cropped, a scar along his jaw that he'd had since before he came to work for Vincent. He had been Vincent's most trusted operational man for 6 years. He ran the logistics, the coordination, the daily management of a dozen moving parts that kept the organization functioning. He was by every visible measure exactly what he appeared to be. Nora had been watching the space around the visible measures, the pauses and the glances and the small adjustments a person makes when they are managing 2 versions of themselves simultaneously. On the night that would change things, Cord was at the bar near the south end of the room. He was nursing a bourbon and looking at his phone with the slightly too focused expression of a man who wants people to think he is simply checking messages and is not in fact reading something that requires his full attention. Nora moved through her section. She cleared a table near the bar. She reached past him for a glass that needed to go back behind the counter, a natural movement unremarkable. In the mirror behind the bar, angled to show the length of the room, she could see the screen of his phone. She did not have time to read what was on it, but she had time to see a name. Felix. She carried the glass back to the service station and set it down carefully and stood for a moment with her back to the room. She went to the back of the service station where the prep counter extended at an angle that created a small corner of privacy. She took her phone from her apron pocket. She opened the camera. She waited. It took 11 minutes. She was refilling ice when Cord picked up his phone again. The bar mirror caught the angle. The name on the screen was visible for 4 seconds. She took the photograph through the reflection. She put her phone back in her apron and finished the ice and went back to her section. She said nothing to anyone that night. She did not sleep when she got home. She lay in her bed in the dark and she looked at the photograph on her phone and she thought about what it meant. And she thought about the box in her closet, the one she had not opened since the week after the funeral, the one that contained her mother's things. She got up. She carried the box to the kitchen table and opened it under the overhead light. There were photographs, a few pieces of jewelry, her parents' marriage certificate in a clear sleeve, a birthday card that Liam had made in 2nd grade out of construction paper and crayon. And at the bottom, under a folded dish towel, a newspaper, Local Chicago, dated 3 years and 1 week ago. Her mother had circled the article about the I-90 accident, her own parents' accident. She had circled it in blue pen, which was the pen her mother always used, kept in a cup on the kitchen counter. The same brand, always blue. Next to the circled article in her mother's careful handwriting, she had written 2 words and underlined them once. Malone Transport, and below that 3 more words. Don't trust them. Nora looked at the newspaper for a long time. She folded it carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. She looked at the clock. It was 4 in the morning. She was at Vincent's office by 9. She did not wait for his assistant to announce her. She walked past the desk and knocked twice and opened the door. He looked up from his desk. He was alone, reading glasses on again. A coffee cup at his right hand half empty. He took the glasses off. She crossed the room and put the newspaper on his desk and said nothing. He looked at it. He looked at the circled article. He looked at the 2 words in blue pen and the 3 words underlined beneath them. He was very still. She said, "That is your company's name, next to where my parents died, in my mother's handwriting." He did not look away from the newspaper. He said, "I know." The words arrived in the room with the weight of something that has been known for a while and has just now been said. She said, "You know." He said, "Desmond brought me information 2 days ago. I have been working through it, building the complete picture before I came to you because I needed to give you the full truth, not a partial one." She said, "Working through it." She repeated this with the flat precision of someone trying to understand what words mean when they are being used to describe something that cannot be adequately described. She said, "My parents are dead, Vincent." He looked at her then, directly, without the careful management she had come to expect from him in most moments. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone when they have decided that management is the wrong response to a moment. He said, "I know that. I know what it cost you. I know what it costs you still. And I am telling you that whoever is responsible for what happened to them will answer for it. I promise you that." She said, "Your promises are not worth anything to me yet." He said nothing. She said, "I am not saying that to hurt you. I am saying it because it is true. I do not know you. I know your mother. I know what I felt in that house, and I know what that means to me. But a promise from someone I do not know is just words." He said, "That is fair." She said, "I need you to tell me what Desmond found." He said, "Sit down." She said, "I would rather stand." He said, "All right." He told her. Not all of it, because the complete picture was still being assembled, but enough. That her father Thomas had worked for Malone Transport as a senior driver and logistics coordinator. That Thomas had been a careful man and a good employee and had seen something he was not supposed to see. That what he had seen was connected to a man inside the organization who had been operating against Vincent's interests for years without Vincent's knowledge. He said her father had not done anything wrong. He said he was going to do the right thing. The evidence points to it. He was building a record. He was preparing to report what he had found through official channels. He stopped. He said he did not get the chance. The room was very quiet. She said, "Who is the man inside the organization?" He said, "I am not going to tell you that yet." She said, "Vincent." He said, "Because if I tell you, you will go find him yourself. And I cannot protect you from what happens after that until I understand the full scope of what he's involved in. When I know that I will tell you everything, and I will let you be there when it is resolved. I give you my word." She looked at him. She said, "Your word again." He said, "I know. It is still all I have to offer you right now." She picked up the newspaper from his desk. She folded it and put it back in her jacket pocket. She said, "Find out the full scope. Quickly." She walked out. In the hallway, she passed Cord Whelan coming in the opposite direction. He nodded at her with the pleasant professional courtesy that she now understood was a performance. Had always been a performance, every interaction she had ever had with him, a performance so smooth she had almost missed it. She nodded back. She walked down the stairs and out into the October morning. That night at the Blackwood Lounge, Cord Whelan was assigned to Shadow Nora's section. This was standard after what had happened with Sal Drift, a precautionary presence, one of Vincent's senior people keeping a visible eye on things. It was exactly the kind of arrangement that made Cord useful and made him trusted and made him invisible in the very ways that mattered. Nora noticed that Cord spent 40 minutes of his 2-hour watch near the South Service corridor, the one that led to the back entrance, in the alley behind the building. She noticed that he checked his phone 3 times in that window. She noticed that when Felix Varro walked into the club at 10:15, something in Cord's posture changed, barely perceptible, the kind of change that meant nothing to anyone who was not already looking for it. At 10:45 during the late rush, Nora was sent to the back to retrieve a case of champagne from the storage room near the service corridor. This was a normal request. She had done it a dozen times. She walked down the corridor with the particular awareness of a woman who had been paying close attention for several days and knew that something was wrong and could not yet prove the full shape of it. The service door at the end of the corridor was propped open 2 inches. It had not been propped open any of the other times she had come back here. She went to the storage room and retrieved the case of champagne and carried it back toward the main floor. Behind her, she heard footsteps in the alley. She turned. Felix Varro was in the doorway. Anton was behind him. She set the case down on the floor carefully, the way you set something down when you need both your hands free. Felix moved into the corridor. The door swung shut behind him. The ambient noise of the club, the music and conversation, and the specific human warmth of a crowded room became muffled and distant, separated from this corridor by a single closed door. He said, "We are not going to hurt you, Nora." She said nothing. He said, "We want information. That is all. Simple exchange. You tell us about the Tuesday port shipment, the dock number, and the crew count, and this conversation never happened." She said, "I am a waitress. I carry drinks. I have no information about port shipments." He said, "See, that is the answer we expected." He took a step toward her. "But here's the thing, Vincent Malone does not extend personal protection to waitresses. Not in any version of history we have ever observed. So whatever you are to him, whatever you know, it is more than drink orders." Anton came around the left side. She backed 1 step and felt the wall of the corridor behind her. Felix reached into his jacket and produced a folding knife. He held it loosely the way an experienced person holds a blade, not threateningly, which was somehow more threatening than threatening would have been. He said, "We are just going to have a conversation." The door at the end of the corridor, the one that led back to the main floor, opened. Cord Whelan stood in it. He looked at Felix. He looked at Anton. He looked at Nora against the wall. He said, "You have 5 minutes. Then I need to be back on the floor." And he stepped back through the door and let it swing shut. Nora understood in the space of 2 seconds exactly what had happened and exactly how long it had been happening and exactly who had built the arrangement that had put her in this corridor. Felix took another step toward her. The door at the far end of the corridor opened. Not the door back to the main floor. The door to the alley. Vincent Malone stood in it. Behind him, 2 men she recognized filled the frame. The light from the alley was behind him, and his face was in shadow, but she could see the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders and the particular quality of stillness that surrounded him in the moments before something decisive happened. He said, "Put it down, Felix." Felix turned, the knife lowered. Anton went completely still against the wall. Vincent walked into the corridor. He walked past Nora without stopping, without breaking the line of his attention, but she felt as he passed the precise focused weight of his awareness of her, that she was there, that she was standing, that she was unhurt. He stopped 3 feet from Felix Varro. He said, "This is the second time you have put your attention on her. There will not be a third." Felix said we were just having a conversation. Vincent said you put a blade in the same room as her, in my building, in my corridor. That is not a conversation, that is a declaration. He looked at Felix for a long moment. He said you are going to leave Chicago, both of you, not by the end of the week, tonight. And you are going to tell everyone you know that this particular avenue of inquiry is permanently closed. Felix looked at the two men behind Vincent. He looked at the knife in his own hand. He folded it and put it in his pocket. He said understood. They left through the alley door. Vincent turned. He looked at Nora in the dim corridor light. He looked at her carefully the way he had looked at her the night in the hallway, checking what the situation had cost her, whether she was still standing in the way that meant something beyond simply being vertical. He said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "No." He said, "You should not have been back here alone." She said, "I was sent to get champagne." It was a normal request. He said it was not a normal request tonight. Cord cleared this corridor 20 minutes ago. The name landed between them. She looked at him. She said, "You know about Cord?" He said, "Yes." She reached into her apron pocket and took out her phone and held it out to him. On the screen was the photograph from the bar mirror. The phone screen, the name Felix visible at the top of the message thread. He looked at the photograph. He said, "When did you take this?" She said, 3 nights ago. He looked at her. He said, "Why did you not tell me?" She said, "Because I was not certain yet. I wanted to be certain before I brought you something that might be wrong." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You were building a record." She said, "Yes." He held the phone for a moment longer. He said, "Your father did the same thing. He saw something wrong and he built a record before he moved because he wanted to be certain the record was unimpeachable before he acted." She said nothing. He said, "You are very much his daughter." He handed her phone back. He said, "Go back to the floor. Tell no one about this. I will handle Cord tonight. By morning, this will be different." She took the phone. She went back to the main floor and finished her shift and carried drinks to tables and smiled at the right moments and said nothing to anyone. And when she left at 2 in the morning, the black SUV was waiting, and she got in and went home and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. She sat there for a long time. She thought about Cord standing in that doorway, the 5 minutes he had offered, the way he had looked at her before he stepped back through the door, not with cruelty, not with particular relish, just with the flat, administrative practicality of a man for whom she was a variable to be managed rather than a person. She thought about her father. She pressed both palms flat against the kitchen table and stayed there until the city outside her window started to go gray with early morning. Then she went to her room and lay down and closed her eyes and waited for what came next. She was at Vincent's office by 9 the following morning. He was not alone. Desmond was there seated across the desk with a folder thick enough that it had been banded twice to keep the pages together. They both looked up when she came in. Vincent gestured to the chair beside Desmond. She sat. She said, "Tell me everything now. All of it, not a partial picture. Everything." Vincent looked at Desmond. Desmond opened the folder. He said, "Your father, Thomas Callahan, joined Malone Transport 11 years ago as a commercial driver. He was promoted to logistics coordinator in his 4th year. He was by every account in the records exceptional at his job. Reliable, precise, detail-oriented. He did not miss a single shift in 11 years. He turned a page. He said just over 2 years before the accident, Thomas noticed discrepancies in the routing documentation for a series of shipments moving through the port of Chicago. Specifically, a pattern of secondary manifests being filed after departure with different cargo declarations than the originals. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people would have attributed to administrative error and moved past. Nora said, but he did not. Desmond said he started keeping his own records, parallel documentation, dates manifest discrepancies. He did it systematically over the following 6 months. He cross-referenced against the payment records he had access to in his role and identified a pattern of payments from a holding company in Indiana that did not correspond to any legitimate cargo contract in the system. He paused. He said he was preparing a formal report. He had identified the employee responsible. He had assembled a compelling and thorough record of what had been happening and who was doing it. He was approximately 2 weeks from submitting that report when the accident occurred. The room was quiet. Nora said, "Cord Whelan." Desmond said yes. She said Cord had access to my father's files. Desmond said Cord had created administrative credentials without authorization, that gave him red access to the logistics coordinator's documentation system. We believe he had been monitoring your father's parallel record as it was assembled. We believe he understood what it meant and what it would cost him when it was submitted. He made a decision approximately 3 weeks before the accident. Nora said he read my father's work, he watched him build the case, and then he had him killed. Desmond said the vehicle used in the accident was registered to a transport company that dissolved 4 days afterward. That company was capitalized through an account traceable to Cord Whelan through 2 intermediary entities. The chain is documented. It holds. She said my mother knew. Desmond said we believe she saw something in your father's behavior in those final weeks. The extra care he was taking, the copies he was making. She may not have known the specifics, but she knew something was wrong. The notation in the newspaper was almost certainly made in the days after the accident when she was trying to understand what had happened. Nora thought about her mother, precise, careful, the blue pen always in the cup on the kitchen counter, the way she had kept everything that mattered in the bottom of a box under a dish towel. She said she kept it. Even then, she kept the record. Desmond said yes. Nora looked at the table in front of her. She thought about her father coming home from work on the ordinary evenings of her childhood, hanging his jacket on the hook, sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee cup. The specific ease of a man who had done a day's honest work and knew it. A man who had looked at something wrong and decided he was going to do something about it because that was simply who he was. She sat with all of that for a moment. Then she said, what happens now? Vincent said Cord has been removed from operations. He is being held. He does not know the full scope of what we have. The Varro brothers left the city last night as instructed, but the operation Cord was running connects to something larger. A state senator who has been using the Varro network for financial and political benefit. Desmond has been building that portion of the file. She said, and then, he said, and then we give everything to the federal authorities. The complete file, Cord, the Varros, the senator, all of it. She looked at him. She said, that is going to cost you. He said, yes. She said, your operation, the parts of it that cannot survive that kind of examination. He said, yes, I know what it costs. He paused. Your father knew what it cost too. He was willing to pay it to do the right thing. I owe him at least the same willingness. She looked at him for a long moment. She said you should have told me when Desmond first told you. Even before the picture was complete, I needed to know. He said, I know. I was trying to give you the full truth rather than a partial one, and I misjudged what you needed. You needed to know as soon as I knew. I will not make that mistake again. She said, no, you will not. He said, is there anything you need from me right now? She said, yes, my brother. When this becomes public, when the investigation begins and names appear, I need Liam's name and mine entirely clear of it. He said that was arranged 2 days ago, before I knew you would ask. Your names do not appear in any documentation that will be submitted. The story is told without you. She looked at him. She said you did that before I asked. He said yes. She sat with that for a moment. Then she stood. She said, I need to go to work. She walked to the door. At the door, she stopped and turned back. She said, my father built his record carefully and thoroughly, and he was 2 weeks from finishing it when someone took everything from him. I want you to know that I understand what it took for him to do that, and I understand what it is going to cost you to finish it, and I think he would have respected you for it. Vincent said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I hope so. She nodded once and walked out. She went to find Cord Whelan alone. She had not told Vincent she was going to do this. She had not told Liam. She had not told anyone because telling someone would have meant giving them the opportunity to stop her, and she was not prepared to be stopped. It was a Thursday morning, early, the kind of early that belongs to the city before it has fully woken up, when the streets have the particular quality of a room that has not yet been entered. She had worked the breakfast shift at Harlan's Diner and finished at 10 and walked out the back door instead of the front. Vincent had told her that Cord was being held. What he had not told her, what he perhaps did not understand she would find necessary, was that being held and being confronted were two different things. The record was complete. The authorities would receive it. Cord would answer for what he had done in the official way, and through the official channels, the same channels her father had been trying to use when Cord had him killed. But there was something Nora needed that the official record could not give her. She needed to say it to his face. She found out from a conversation she was not supposed to overhear two men in the back lot of the Blackwood Lounge that morning that Cord was being kept in the office on the second floor until Vincent decided how to proceed. She went in through the service entrance. She took the stairs. She walked down the hallway past the photographs of Chicago and the gap-toothed boy in the baseball uniform, and she opened the door to the secondary conference room. Cord was there. He was seated at the table. There were no restraints. There were two men in the room who looked up when she entered, and then looked at each other, and then, because they recognized her and knew what she was, to Vincent Malone did not stop her. She walked to the table. She stood across from Cord. She said, "You killed my parents." She said it the way she said everything that mattered, quietly, without performance, the way you say something that is simply true. He looked at her. Something moved through his face. He looked older than he had behind the bar at the Blackwood Lounge. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for 3 years and had recently been relieved of it, not in the way you are relieved of something you have finished, but in the way you are relieved of something that has been taken from you. He said, "You should not be here." She said, "I know, I'm here anyway." He said, "Whatever you think you are going to get from this." She said, "I am not trying to get anything. I am trying to say something." He was quiet. She said, "My father saw what you were doing, and he built a record because he believed that what was right and what was true deserved to be documented. He did it carefully. He did it thoroughly. He was 2 weeks from finishing it when you had him killed." She paused. She said, "My mother raised her children alone after that. I dropped out of college. My brother grew up without his father. 3 years of ordinary life unmade. Because you decided a man who was doing the right thing was a variable to be managed." Cord said, "I was protecting an operation that kept 40 people employed in 3 revenue streams running. Your father was going to bring all of it down." She said, "My father was going to tell the truth." He said nothing. She said, "I am not here to argue with you about it. I am not here to hurt you. I am here because he did not get to finish what he started, and I did, and I needed you to know that someone who loved him was standing in a room looking you in the eye when the record was completed." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned and walked out. In the hallway, Vincent was standing against the wall. He had his hands in his pockets, and his face had the particular quality it had when he was controlling something carefully. He said, "How did you know where he was?" She said, "I listened." He said, "I should have told you where he was." She said, "Yes, you should have." He said, "Are you all right?" She thought about it honestly. She said, "Yes, I think so." He walked beside her down the hallway toward the stairs. He said what you just did, going in there alone, saying what you needed to say. She said, "Yes." He said, "Your father would have done the same thing." She stopped walking. She stood in the hallway and she let that sit inside her for a moment, the specific weight of it, the way it was both difficult and necessary. She said, "I know." They walked down the stairs together and out into the Thursday morning. The FBI came on a Wednesday. They came quietly, which was how things of significance tended to come in Vincent Malone's world. Not with the dramatic early morning arrival of vehicles and loudspeakers, but with appointments and briefcases and the careful professional courtesy of people who understand that a cooperative source is more valuable than an antagonized one. Desmond was there. Vincent was there. Nora was not there, which was the arrangement, and she spent that Wednesday morning making omelets at Harlan's Diner and listening to the radio and working through the breakfast rush with the same steady professionalism she brought to every shift. The investigation that followed took several months to complete. The state senator, whose connections to the Vero operation were documented in enough detail to withstand federal scrutiny, resigned from office in January. Felix and Anton Vero were indicted in February. The full scope of Cord Whelan's actions was entered into the public record in a document that would be read by prosecutors and judges, and eventually by Liam Callahan, who was by then in his second semester at the university. He had put at the top of his list studying accounting because he wanted to understand the numbers his father had understood and to do with that understanding what his father had tried to do. Malone Transport ceased operations the month after the FBI meeting. It was replaced after a period of restructuring that Vincent managed with the same deliberate precision he brought to everything by a logistics company that operated entirely within the legal economy. It handled commercial freight and port coordination and delivery for businesses across the Chicago metro area. It employed 43 people. It was incorporated under a new name filed with the state of Illinois. The name on the incorporation documents was Callahan Logistics. Nora found out about the name when May told her on a Sunday in November over pasta and bread in the dining room in Oak Park. May said it the way she said things that mattered simply and without flourish. Nora put down her fork. She said he did not tell me. May said he wanted to ask you first, but he was afraid you would say no. Nora said I would not have said no. May said I know. That is what I told him. After dinner, Nora found Vincent in the garden. He was standing near the rose bushes that May had been tending since late spring, bare now in November, cut back to their structural form, waiting for what came next. He was looking at them with the expression he sometimes wore when he thought he was not being observed, something less managed than his usual face, something that showed the years in it. She stood beside him. She said, Callahan Logistics. He said, if you would rather, I change it. She said, I would not. He said, your father built something honest in the middle of something dishonest, and it cost him everything. The least I can do is put his name on the honest version. She looked at the rose bushes. She said he would have liked that. He was a straightforward man. He would have liked the directness of it. Vincent said, I am sorry I did not know him when I had the chance. She said, you know him now. Through the record, he left. He looked at her. She said, you have known him longer than you realize. Everything I am that you thought was worth protecting. That came from him, from both of them. So you have been acting in his name for a while now, without knowing it. Vincent was quiet for a long moment. He said, I can live with that. She said, good. They stood in May's garden in November, and the city was somewhere beyond the stone wall, present always but at a distance that permitted this particular moment to exist without interruption. She said, I want to say something, and I need you to just hear it without responding right away. He said, all right. She said, I do not know what this is, what we are. I know what your mother is to me, and I know what I feel in this house, and I know that you have kept every promise you made to me since the night in the hallway, even the ones you made before I said they were worth anything. I know that you put my brother's future outside the reach of anything that could damage it before I asked you to, because you knew it mattered to me. I know that you named a company after my father without telling me, because you were afraid I would say no, and you did not want to give me the chance to refuse something you believed I deserved. She paused. She said, I do not know what to do with all of that. I am still learning, but I wanted you to know that I see it, all of it. Vincent said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, I told you once that good people are rare in my world. What I did not say is that when you find one, you change your world to be worth them. You do not ask them to adjust to what you already are. She said, are you changing your world? He said, I have been changing it since the night you walked out of my office and told me my promises were not worth anything to you yet. She looked at him. She said, they are worth something now. He said, good. They went inside. On a Tuesday in late January, Nora was closing up the counter at Harlan's Diner after the breakfast rush. When Vincent came in, he sat at the counter. He was not dressed for the Blackwood Lounge. He was in a dark wool coat over a sweater, and he looked like a man who had walked somewhere rather than been driven. Rita looked at him. She looked at Nora. She set a coffee cup in front of him and went to check on a table that did not require checking on. Nora came around the counter. She sat down on the stool next to his. He said, I wanted to ask you something. She said, all right. He said, I have been thinking about what you said in the garden, about not knowing what this is. She said, yes. He said, I do not know either. I want to be honest about that. I know what it feels like. I know what it costs me when you are not somewhere I can reach you. I know that I have reorganized a significant portion of my life around the fact of your existence without making a formal decision to do so. But I do not have the language for what that is. Not one that feels adequate to it. She looked at him. She said, neither do I. He said, I am not asking you to name it. I am asking if you are willing to keep finding out what it is. With me. Without a particular timeline. She considered this. She considered it the way she considered things that mattered fully without rushing the conclusion. She said, I think my father would have liked you. Not because of the protection or the power or any of that. Because of the way you talk about things, directly, without hiding what something costs. He said, I take that seriously. She said, I know, that is the point. She reached across the counter and picked up the coffee pot and refilled his cup. She said, yes, I am willing to keep finding out. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Outside, Chicago moved through its January morning gray and cold, and entirely indifferent to the small warm fact occurring inside a diner on a Tuesday. Two people sitting at a counter with coffee between them in the middle of a city that had cost them both a great deal finding out what something was. 6 weeks after that, on the first Sunday in March, when the temperature had climbed just enough to suggest the possibility of something different coming, Nora stood on the sidewalk outside the building that used to say Malone Transport and now said Callahan Logistics in clean dark letters above the entrance. She was not thinking about the investigation or the files or the long, careful work her father had done in the years before she lost him. She had thought about all of that. She had thought about it thoroughly and in full, and she had set it in the place where things go when they have been fully considered and the considering is done. She was thinking about her father coming home from work on the ordinary evenings of her childhood, hanging his jacket on the hook by the door, asking what was for dinner, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the specific ease of a man who had done a day's honest work and knew it. A man who had looked at something wrong and decided he was going to do something about it because that was simply who he was, not because it was safe or strategic or likely to end well, but because it was right. She thought about how he had loved his family with the same directness he had brought to everything else. No excess, no performance, just the quiet, persistent fact of showing up every day, doing the right thing because it was the right thing. She looked at the letters above the door. Callahan Logistics. She thought I finished it, Dad. She thought we are okay. The pendant was warm at her collarbone. The city moved around her in its constant way, and somewhere in it, Liam was at his desk in his dormitory learning to understand numbers the way their father had understood them. May was in her garden in Oak Park deciding what to plant when the ground thawed. Vincent Malone was somewhere making decisions that were different from the decisions he used to make, shaped by everything that had happened in the months since a woman got on her knees on a pavement in a farmer's market and stayed. Nora stood on the sidewalk until she was ready. Then she walked back to the L stop and took the train to Wicker Park and put on her apron and worked the lunch shift the same as always, steady and present. She had never done any of it to be seen. She had done it because it was right. Her father had understood that. Now the city carried his name on a building and his daughter carried her mother's pendant, and somewhere in the long, ordinary continuation of things, that was enough. It had always been enough.